Pass the hash attack overview. Welcome to the channel. Please consider subscribing. I produce videos daily covering a wide variety of cloud topics with focus on networking. Also, hit the bell icon to get notified of new videos. Pass the hash represents one of the most devastating attack techniques in modern Windows environments, enabling attackers to move laterally across networks without ever needing to crack or know actual passwords. This attack exploits a fundamental design characteristic of Windows authentication where NTLM hashes can be used directly for authentication instead of plaintext passwords. Unlike traditional credential theft where attackers must crack stolen password hashes to obtain usable credentials, Pass the hash allows the hash itself to serve as the authentication credential, making password complexity completely irrelevant as a defense mechanism. The fundamental vulnerability stems from how Windows implements NTLM authentication. When a user logs into a Windows system, the operating system computes a one-way cryptographic hash of their password using either the LM or NTLM algorithm, with modern systems using NTLM v2. This hash is then stored in the local security authority subsystem service memory space, commonly abbreviated as LSASS. The critical security issue is that LSASS keeps these hashes in memory for the duration of the user's session to facilitate single sign-on functionality. When the user attempts to access network resources, Windows retrieves the hash from LSASS memory and uses it directly in the NTLM challenge response authentication protocol without ever needing the original password. This design creates an attack opportunity. If an attacker gains administrative access to a Windows system and can read the LSASS process memory, they can extract the NTLM hashes of all users who have authenticated to that system. Once extracted, these hashes can be injected into the attacker's own authentication context and used to authenticate to other systems in the network that accept NTLM authentication. From the perspective of the target system, the authentication appears completely legitimate because the attacker is presenting a valid hash through the proper cryptographic protocol. There is no indication that the authentication is coming from an unauthorized source, or that the original password is unknown to the attacker. Pass the hash attacks are particularly dangerous in enterprise environments because of credential reuse patterns. System administrators often use the same local administrator account with the same password across multiple servers for convenience in management. If an attacker compromises one server and extracts the local administrator's NTLM hash, they can immediately use that hash to authenticate to dozens or hundreds of other servers using the same credentials. This creates a cascading compromise scenario where gaining administrative access to a single system can lead to complete domain takeover within hours. The attack is silent, leaves minimal forensic evidence, and bypasses traditional password security controls like complexity requirements, rotation policies, and multi-factor authentication for local accounts. NTLM authentication and hash extraction with Mimikatz. Understanding pass the hash requires examining both the NTLM authentication protocol and the tools attackers use to extract credential material from memory. NTLM authentication operates as a challenge response protocol that proves knowledge of a password hash without transmitting the hash over the network. When a client attempts to authenticate to a server, the server sends a random challenge value. The client encrypts this challenge using their NTLM hash as the encryption key and sends the encrypted result back to the server. The server performs the same encryption operation using its copy of the user's hash and compares the results. If they match, authentication succeeds. The critical detail for pass the hash attacks is that the NTLM protocol only requires the hash, not the password. The challenge response cryptographic operation is performed using the hash as the key, meaning anyone possessing the hash can complete the authentication exchange successfully. This is fundamentally different from protocols like Kerberos where the password is used to derive encryption keys through additional cryptographic operations, making simple hash reuse more difficult, though not impossible, through similar attacks like pass the ticket. Mimikatz is the most well-known tool for extracting credentials from Windows systems and has become synonymous with pass-the-hash attacks. Developed by French security researcher Benjamin Delpy, Mimikatz is a post-exploitation tool that reads the LSASS process memory to extract plaintext passwords, NTLM hashes, Kerberos tickets, and other authentication credentials. The tool works by leveraging Windows debugging APIs and direct memory access to locate and decrypt credential structures stored in LSASS. Modern versions of Mimikatz can bypass various Windows security mechanisms and extract credentials even from systems with some protections enabled. The typical Mimikatz workflow begins with privilege escalation to obtain system or local administrator privileges on the target machine. This is necessary because reading LSASS memory requires elevated permissions and the say debugged privilege token. Once running with appropriate privileges, the attacker executes Mimikatz and uses the sekurlsa module to dump credentials from memory. The tool displays the username, domain, and NTLM hash for every user who has authenticated to the system. These credentials remain in memory even after the user logs off, potentially persisting for hours or days depending on system configuration and uptime. A particularly powerful Mimikatz capability is its ability to perform pass-the-hash directly. After extracting hashes, the attacker can use the sekurlsa pth command to inject the stolen hash into a new process, effectively impersonating the victim user. This creates a new command prompt or PowerShell session running with the victim's security context, allowing the attacker to access network resources exactly as if they had the user's password. The attack is completely transparent to Windows security logging because the authentication mechanisms see only legitimate NTLM authentication attempts using valid credentials. Detection requires behavioral analysis and anomaly detection rather than signature-based security tools. Lateral movement with PSExec and WMI. Once an attacker has extracted NTLM hashes through Mimikatz or similar tools, the next phase is lateral movement. This involves using those credentials to access other systems in the network. Two primary techniques dominate this phase: PSExec-based remote command execution and Windows Management Instrumentation remote procedure calls. Both methods leverage legitimate Windows administrative tools and protocols, making the activity difficult to distinguish from normal IT operations without proper monitoring and behavioral baselines. PSExec, originally developed by Microsoft sysinternals as a legitimate system administration tool, has become a staple of both administrators and attackers. The tool operates by copying an executable to the remote system's ADMIN $share, creating a Windows service to run that executable, starting the service, and communicating with it over a named pipe. When combined with pass-the-hash, attackers use tools like Impacket's PSExec.py, which accept NTLM hashes directly instead of passwords. The command syntax is straightforward. Provide the target IP address, username, and NTLM hash, and PSExec establishes a remote command shell with system privileges on the target. The PSExec lateral movement technique requires several conditions to succeed. The attacker must have credentials for an account that is a member of the local administrators group on the target system. The ADMIN share must be accessible, which requires SMB ports 139 and 445 to be reachable and not blocked by host or network firewalls. Additionally, if the remote system has user account control enabled, the account must be the built-in administrator account, or UAC remote restrictions must be disabled by modifying the registry. Despite these requirements, most enterprise environments have configurations that allow PSExec to function, particularly for domain administrator accounts or local administrator accounts with shared passwords across systems. Windows Management Instrumentation provides an alternative lateral movement method that operates entirely through WMI remote procedure calls. WMI is a management framework built into Windows that allows administrators to query system information and execute commands remotely. Attackers leverage the WMI command line tool WMIC or more sophisticated tools like Impacket's WMIEXEC.py to execute commands on remote systems using stolen NTLM hashes. The advantage of WMI over PSExec is stealth. WMI does not require writing files to disk or creating new services, making it harder to detect with traditional endpoint security tools. The WMI lateral movement process begins with establishing a WMI connection to the remote system using the stolen credentials. The attacker then uses the Win32 process class with the create method to execute commands on the remote system. Output is typically retrieved by redirecting command results to files on network shares or by using additional WMI queries to read command output. Because WMI is a legitimate administrative tool used extensively in enterprise environments for software deployment, patch management, and monitoring, distinguishing malicious WMI activity from legitimate operations requires careful analysis of command patterns, unusual source systems, and temporal anomalies like after-hours administrative activity from non-administrative workstations. Attack chain and persistence mechanisms. A complete pass-the-hash attack campaign follows a methodical progression from initial compromise through credential harvesting, lateral movement, privilege escalation, and ultimately domain compromise. Understanding this attack chain is essential for defenders to identify the appropriate points for detection and intervention. The typical scenario begins with an attacker gaining initial access to a single workstation or server through phishing, exploiting a web application vulnerability, or leveraging stolen credentials for VPN or RDP access. Once the attacker has established their initial foothold, the first priority is privilege escalation to obtain local administrator or SYSTEM privileges. This might involve exploiting unpatched vulnerabilities, abusing misconfigured services, or leveraging stored credentials in scripts or configuration files. With administrative access achieved, the attacker deploys Mimikatz or similar credential harvesting tools to extract NTLM hashes from LSASS memory. At this stage, the value of the compromise depends entirely on which users have authenticated to the compromised system. A workstation might yield only standard user credentials, while a server could provide service account or administrator credentials. The attacker analyzes the harvested credentials to identify high-value targets. Domain administrator accounts provide immediate domain takeover capabilities. Service accounts often have excessive privileges and might be used across multiple systems. Even standard user accounts can be valuable if they belong to IT staff who might have administrative access to specific servers. The attacker then uses PSExec, WMI, or other lateral movement techniques to access additional systems using the stolen hashes, repeating the credential harvesting process on each newly compromised system. This iterative process continues until domain administrator credentials are obtained or the attacker has sufficient access to accomplish their objectives. Domain compromise through pass-the-hash typically culminates in one of several persistence mechanisms. The most devastating is the creation of a golden ticket, which requires extracting the KRBTGT account hash from a domain controller. With the KRBTGT hash, attackers can forge Kerberos ticket-granting tickets for any user with any privileges, effectively granting permanent domain administrator access that survives password resets and account lockouts. Alternative persistence methods include creating new domain administrator accounts, modifying group memberships, installing backdoors on critical servers, or establishing external command and control channels through scheduled tasks or registry run keys. The timeline for a complete attack chain varies based on network size, security controls, and attacker sophistication, but well-resourced threat actors can progress from initial workstation compromise to domain administrator access in hours. Automated tools like Bloodhound map Active Directory attack paths, identifying the shortest route from current access to domain administrator privileges. Combined with PowerShell Empire or Cobalt Strike frameworks that automate credential harvesting, lateral movement, and persistence, even moderately skilled attackers can execute devastating campaigns. The speed and stealth of these attacks make prevention through security architecture and rapid detection through behavioral monitoring absolutely critical. Defense strategies and mitigation controls. Defending against pass-the-hash attacks requires a comprehensive, layered approach that addresses credential protection, network segmentation, privileged access management, and detection capabilities. No single control provides complete protection, but combining multiple defensive measures significantly increases the difficulty and cost for attackers while providing defenders multiple opportunities for detection and response. The most effective defenses prevent credential theft at the source, limit the utility of stolen credentials, and detect anomalous authentication patterns that indicate ongoing attacks. Windows Credential Guard represents Microsoft's primary technical defense against credential theft from LSASS memory. Credential Guard uses virtualization-based security to isolate the LSASS process into a secure virtual environment that is isolated from the normal Windows kernel and user mode processes. Even if an attacker achieves system privileges, they cannot read credential material from the isolated LSASS environment because it runs at a higher privilege level than the host operating system. Credential Guard is available on Windows 10 Enterprise and Windows Server 2016 and later, requiring UEFI firmware with secure boot and compatible TPM hardware. While Credential Guard significantly raises the bar for credential theft, it does not prevent all attacks. Attackers can still extract credentials through keyboard logging, network interception, or by compromising the user before Credential Guard protection is established. Privileged Access Workstations, commonly abbreviated as PAWs, implement the principle of separation of duties by creating dedicated, hardened workstations exclusively for administrative tasks. Under the PAW model, administrators perform standard user activities, like email and web browsing, on regular workstations but must switch to dedicated PAW systems for any administrative work. These PAW workstations are locked down with restricted application whitelisting, no internet access, limited software installation capabilities, and enhanced monitoring. The architecture ensures that if an administrator's regular workstation is compromised through phishing or web-based attacks, the attacker gains only standard user credentials. Administrative credentials never touch potentially compromised endpoints, eliminating the primary vector for high-privilege credential theft. Local Administrator Password Solution, known as LAPS, addresses the common practice of using identical local administrator passwords across multiple systems. LAPS is a free Microsoft tool that automatically generates unique, random passwords for the local administrator account on each managed system, stores those passwords in Active Directory with a CLS restricting read access to authorized personnel, and rotates the passwords on a regular schedule. By eliminating password reuse across systems, LAPS prevents lateral movement scenarios where compromising one system's local administrator provides access to dozens or hundreds of other systems. Even if an attacker extracts the local administrator hash from one machine, that credential only works on that single system. Network segmentation and authentication protocol restrictions limit the spread of pass-the-hash attacks by controlling where credentials can be used. Organizations should disable NTLM authentication where possible, forcing the use of Kerberos, which is more resistant to hash reuse attacks. For systems that must support NTLM network authentication should be restricted using Windows firewall rules or network access control lists that prevent workstations from authenticating directly to other workstations. This workstation isolation model forces administrative access to flow through jump servers or bastion hosts where enhanced monitoring can detect anomalous activity. Additionally, tiered administrative models separate domain administrators from server administrators and workstation administrators, ensuring that compromise of lower-tier credentials does not provide pathways to domain administrator access. Detection and monitoring provide the last line of defense when preventive controls fail. Security information and event management systems should collect and correlate Windows event logs, particularly Event ID 4624 for successful logons and Event ID 4625 for failed logons. Anomalous patterns indicating pass-the-hash attacks include authentication attempts from unusual source systems, administrative logons to workstations from non-IT user accounts, logon types 3 and 10 from workstation to workstation, and high-velocity lateral movement patterns where the same credentials authenticate to multiple systems in rapid succession. Endpoint detection and response tools monitor for Mimikatz execution, LSASS memory access, and suspicious process creation patterns associated with PSExec or WMI-based lateral movement. Honeypot accounts with attractive names like admin or SVC_backup but no legitimate usage can serve as tripwires, generating high-confidence alerts when their credentials are used. Thank you for your attendance. Please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video.